Wonderful. Okay, hello. Welcome to Skype a Scientist Live. My name is Sarah McAnulty. I run the Skype a Scientist program, and today we are super lucky to have Jiwan Kohli. Jiwan, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here today to talk about the brain.
All right, great. So just to do some quick housekeeping, thank you all for coming. When you have a question today, this is all about your curiosity. So submit your questions to the Q&A. It's at the bottom. The chat is more for like functional problems, like if you're like, I can't hear the sound, or what's happening next week. Questions for me, go ahead and ask them in the chat. Only I'll be able to see them, and the other panelists. If you have questions that are science related, ask them in the Q&A, and we will get to those after Jiwan's brief introduction into brains and how we look at them. Next week, we will be having a session as well. We have sessions every single week. And I will give you the link to next week's session, which is about geology. So stay tuned for that. But I will stop talking now and hand it over to talk all about brains. Jiwan, take it away.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to share my screen here, pop up some slides to make this a little bit easier. And I thought it would be helpful to tell everybody a little bit more about myself and sort of what my area of neuroscience is. And this comes with a big caveat. You'll see the word psychology a lot over this page, because that's my background. So I studied psychology in college. I've got a couple of master's degrees in different kinds of psychology. And now I'm a PhD student in clinical psychology with an emphasis in neuropsychology. So that's where the neuro comes in for me, because I'm really interested in the relationships between the brain and behavior. And I use some really cool tools to answer questions about links between the brain and behavior. So I'm going to dive right into my main tool, which is neuroimaging, and a specific type of neuroimaging called MRI, which, as it turns out, can be used to collect a lot of different types of information about the brain. So first up here, we have what's called an anatomical image, an anatomical MRI. And some of you out there who maybe have broken some bones or had other questions about what's going on inside of you may have even had an MRI in the past. It's a big tube, it's a big giant magnet that lets us take pictures inside of the brain. In the brain and the rest of the body, but I'm obviously more interested in the brain than anything else. So here we actually have a picture of my brain, and you can see it's broken up into different slices depending on the angle that you kind of look at. And you can extract a lot of information from a basic picture of the brain. So you can see in this image up here, we've drawn some lines, and suddenly we can start talking about things like the area in a certain region of the brain, or the distance between this point in the brain and this point in the brain. And these are all things that vary between individuals and can vary based on things that might go wrong in the brain, different disorders or acquired brain injuries. So the anatomy of the brain can tell us a lot about what's going on that may have a relationship to behavior. Down here, we can see some schematics of something that unfolds in really early life, even before people are born. There's this process of folding of the outside of the brain, because humans have really, really big brains. There's a lot of brain to pack into our heads here. And so it sort of crinkles up as people develop. And so that's one of my other areas of interest, brain development. And I have a particular interest in this process of brain folding. So I'll be very happy to answer questions about how the brain folds and how that might look different for some different people. But there are a couple of different other types of MRI that we can look at. So another one that we use is called diffusion MRI. And this one I think is the coolest, because we get these really rad images. I like to call them brainbows. But basically what this type of MRI does is it looks at the way that water is flowing throughout the brain. So you can see this is another schematic here with these little lines that represent a water molecule kind of bouncing around. And the way that the water bounces around lets us make inferences or really good educated guesses about how different parts of the brain are connected to each other. So we can use that, information we got about how water is bouncing around, and look at these maps, these colorful maps that also have a lot of information in them. So you can see it's mainly red, blue, and green. And what red means is that connections, we believe, are flowing mostly from right to left. And what green means is that the connections are flowing largely from front to back of your brain. And blue means up and down. And so we can take that one step further and we can start actually drawing schematics of these lines of what we think these are nerve fiber bundles of how the brain is connected to itself. So that's one other really cool type of MRI. And then lastly, another one that we use a lot in my lab is a type of functional fMRI. You may have heard of fMRI, where you sit in the scanner and they ask you to do something and then measure what your brain activity looks like in response to that. But we use a type of MRI a little bit more commonly called functional connectivity, where you don't even have to do a task. You can just lie in the scanner and it collects information about what the regional brain activity looks like. And then we can start asking questions about what seems to be coordinating activity between different parts of the brain, and we can draw brain networks. So we can say something about how this region of the brain and this region of the brain seem to be acting in coordination or in some sort of synchronicity. So this is another piece of information we can get from MRI. And one of my main big interests is how we can combine these different types of MRI to answer more sophisticated questions about brain structure, brain function, and how that relates to behavior. So with that, I will get rid of these guys here and happy to answer questions that you might have.
Sorry, muted. My cat sometimes while these are going on just starts screaming. So I have to make sure to mute myself so you don't all hear my cat just singing, we'll call it. Okay, so we have questions already coming in. So we got a question from Richard. Why does the brain shrink a bit as we get older?
Yeah, so there are a few things that can contribute to tissue loss with aging, which is a totally normal thing that happens. It's not necessarily pathological, but that can result from sort of water loss, which will be contributing to a certain amount of shrinking. But it can also be from actual loss of neurons as time goes on, because there is a little bit of that happens to everybody as we age.
All right, we've got a question somewhat related to that. Salo in second grade is asking this question. Are there any exercises or surgery that someone can have in order to improve their intelligence?
This is a great question. So I will say I am not a neurologist. I'm not a medical doctor, but I'm not aware of any sort of elective brain surgery to enhance abilities for anybody. So, intelligence, I can speak from a psychological perspective, is a really complicated and difficult thing to measure. How do you define intelligence? There are all sorts of different types of intelligences. So, it would be, I think, a long time before we're able to target anything with precise kind of surgery to make a change in someone's abilities in that way. But you might have brain surgery to address kind of the opposite of that. So rather than in the hopes of improving something for somebody who's already normal, if you have some sort of brain injury, if you have some sort of brain cancer, you might have surgery to remove that or to stop bleeding. And that will, of course, be very helpful.
For sure. Cool. All right, we've got a 12th grade neuroscience class, Miss Lewis's class. I think it's amazing that you're learning neuroscience at all in high school. That's amazing. That's amazing. I didn't learn it until my senior year of college. All right. Are there any hypotheses about evolutionary changes that might happen in our brains over the next 1,000 years? That's a tough question.
This is a tough question. So I can't think of anything off of the top of my head in terms of, what we're expecting for human evolution over the next 1,000 years. That's also like a time scale that's very different from the type of brain development that I'm looking at. So I'm looking at brain development within an individual, within groups of individuals, and across the human lifespan. So I can't say that I know as much about kind of the evolutionary perspective on brain development and how it varies between different species. But one thing that I can comment on that I do have a little bit of expertise in is that image that I was showing you of the brain folding. Humans have a shocking amount of brain folding, and compared to other animals that are a little bit lower in terms of what we might think about as intelligence, we have quite a bit more. And so that's something that's happened on an evolutionary sort of timescale, is that humans have developed this really interesting way to pack a lot more brain into our heads than some other animals.
Very cool. So we had a question relating to that folding. Does the brain fold to add more surface area? And yeah, is it a surface area thing, or is it like how does the folding get more brain in less space?
Absolutely, it is. That is exactly it. It's a surface area thing. So it's not, that we're constrained to a particular volume inside of our heads. Our brain can't go beyond our skull. But rather than just being one big sort of balloon, smooth surface, by folding, we can pack in a lot more of a part of the brain that's called the cortex, also sometimes referred to as the gray matter. So on those MRI images that I was showing you, there's this kind of darker band of brain on the outside, and then the lighter white matter inside that's sort of connecting those pieces of gray matter to each other. And so by folding, we can fit in a lot more of that gray matter or cortex.
Awesome. Blake wants to know, what does your day-to-day work look like as a neuroscientist?
I love this question. So I, part of the reason why I popped up a little bit of information about my background and my training in psychology is that I get to do so many different types of things as part of my job, even as a doctoral student. I'm not a psychologist yet. I'm also still working on, getting my PhD, but already I'm getting to do really varying things from day to day. So for today, for example, after this Q&A session, I'm going to run over to the MRI scanner to collect some data on a participant in one of our studies. And then I'm going to head over to the computer lab, and I'm going to do a little bit of computer work to process that data so that it can be analyzed later on. On a different day, I might be seeing a participant or a patient in the clinic to do what are called neuropsychological assessments. So that's where the behavior aspect comes in, where we're asking them to do things like puzzles and talk about different words and all sorts of different tasks to get a sense of how their brain is functioning in their everyday life. So I do a little bit of that. And then the other big part of what I do is writing. So we collect and analyze all of this data, and we spend a lot of time writing that up for consumption by other scientists. And I'm also interested in science communication, so talking to non-scientists about the science that we do. So outreach is another big part of my job, which is why I'm really happy to be doing something like this today.
Awesome. We're happy to have you here. Awesome. Very cool. The next question is, I'm going to combine two questions from two people because they're somewhat related. Yamlet in 3rd grade wants to know, how can I grow my brain and be smarter? And Ria, somewhat relatedly, asks, so you're a neuroscientist. And so from that, you may have learned a lot about the brain and how our behaviors change the brain. Have you created any habits after becoming a neuroscientist?
I like these questions. Okay. How can I grow my brain? So the answer to that question is to take care of your health more generally. So there aren't really specific things that you necessarily need to do to target brain health on its own. But if you take care of yourself by getting regular exercise and eating a good diet and participating in activities and hanging out with friends, those are generally the best things that you can do to support your brain health. And, especially for children whose brains are still growing, it's really important for them to do those things, like get regular activity and have a balanced, healthy diet, because for that exact reason, there are certain periods during which your brain is experiencing growth or change that make it a little bit more sensitive to those environmental factors and the things that you're doing. And then the second question about habits that I've developed, I don't know that my neuroscience work has influenced the things that I'm doing directly. So maybe not from the MRI, but from a psychology perspective, there are, you know, certain things that you can do to support a healthy lifestyle. So one of the things that I'm a huge advocate for is being involved in all sorts of different things. So one thing that I like to talk about is that, you know, I'm not just a neuroscientist. I do a lot of different things in my life. Some people out there may know that I'm an avid baker. And so I think it's really important to have hobbies. So in terms of habits that I've sort of been influenced to invest in by my work, I would say it's cultivating hobbies like baking, photography. Get out there and do things that bring you a sense of joy and happiness outside of your work.
Amazing. And I'm also going to say that your baking brings me joy because your cakes are so gorgeous. Jiwan puts the pictures of them on Instagram, and some of them are so intricate and beautiful that it's like, I'm just so impressed. It's unbelievable. All right. The next question is from Caleb in grade 7. How can you get to the brain without opening the skull? Are these just like, how do we slice through without slicing through?
I love this question too, because, you know, I've been doing this type of work for, you know, close to a decade now, and I still think it is the coolest thing that we can see a person's brain without cutting into them. And you know, it's part of the reason why I didn't really want to go to medical school is that I like to look at the brain while it's still inside the person and they're still okay.
Yeah.
So that's the beauty of this technology that we have called MRI. It stands for magnetic resonance imaging. And like I said, it's a big magnet. And as it turns out, there are aspects of our kind of human anatomy that are responsive to these magnetic fields that an MRI scanner generates. So without getting into the kind of nitty-gritty physics of it, which I'll admit that I also don't fully understand, basically the pulses that this magnet sends out, there are atoms in our brain that respond to that, and they sort of line up and emit a signal as they're going back to their normal natural state. And that's what the MRI scanner is measuring. And so this little signal shows up as all of these gray dots on a MRI image. And so we're collecting those images kind of one slice at a time, one plane through the brain at a time. And then we slap them all together to measure that 3D image of the brain that we can then scroll through. So actually, I was sort of excited to show this as well. Because I showed you one sort of piece of an MRI, or maybe 3 pieces of an MRI that are just individual slices through a person's brain. But when we stack those slices together, we can take a stroll and walk through somebody's brain in 3D. And like I said, this happens to be my brain, and I never get tired of just scrolling through and seeing that this is what is inside my head. And I was able to get this picture without cutting into myself. So this is one of the things that you can do is you can sort of step through and walk through the different planes in somebody's brain and see what the anatomy looks like and make sure that there's nothing abnormal. And then we can use computer programs and mathematical modeling to get those really more sophisticated and useful measurements out of an anatomical image like this.
That's so cool. So like a little spooky inside your head.
It's great for getting spooky pictures for Halloween.
Yes, 'tis the season for MRIs. Love that. All right, so we got a couple questions all sort of dancing around the same question from Mrs. Edwards AP Gen Chemistry class, and also some other folks who are including Rachel. So when there are alterations in the brain, like let's say with Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, schizophrenia, or neurodivergent people, can you see that in these MRI scans? And in which cases can you and which can't you?
Yeah, that is going to have an answer that comes up a lot in science, and that is it depends.
Yeah.
So there are a number of disorders or differences in people that you can see in the brain. So and it'll also vary from individual to individual, even within a particular type of disorder, and depending on the time course of that disorder. So let's take Alzheimer's as an example. That is something that you might not be able to see in the brain initially, and that we can actually get a much better sense of in terms of behavior and memory assessments early on. But then later on, you can look at brain images of a particular region in the brain called the hippocampus that supports memory, and you can see that that part of the brain has been impacted. It might take some time, and it might be after you've already realized that something is going awry, but it is something you can see in the brain. And there are all sorts of what we call sort of acquired brain injuries or acquired problems like strokes or head injury that you can very easily see on an MRI scan, for example. But when it comes to some other disorders, so one area of interest of mine that's primary to my doctoral studies and my dissertation is autism spectrum disorder. And we're really interested in using these different MRI tools to see if we can identify differences in brains that inform us about whether it's causes or consequences of having ASD. And as it turns out, looking at these images of the type that I showed you, looking within an individual person, you can't tell whether somebody has ASD or not. You can't tell whether somebody has ADHD or not. And it's really more through the behavioral assessments that we do that you would be able to make that sort of determination. And it's really only from a research perspective, a neuroimaging research perspective, it's generally only when you look at groups of people, large groups of people, and compare them to people who don't have the disorder that you're interested in, that you start to see some differences. But these differences vary from study to study, and we're still grappling with how we can use these really cool tools to make determinations that affect a single individual. And we're just not quite there yet with MRI, at least for those disorders.
Cool. Thanks for answering that. Our next question is from high school chemistry student Patrick. Patrick might be the teacher, I'm not sure. Wondering what type of activities you've studied using functional MRI, and what's the most surprising thing that you've found as a scientist? The most surprising finding you've had?
Yeah, so I will say that my specialty is the kind of brain structure. So I spend a lot more time looking at brain anatomy than brain function. But we can ask lots of questions about brain activity, and we do in the lab with both that functional connectivity MRI that we've talked about, and also task MRI. So for example, we run a study in the lab on the processing of words and seeing what regions of the brain are activated in response to certain types of words, certain categories of words, fake words that look like words but aren't real words. So yeah, all sorts of nifty things you can look at with functional MRI. In terms of generally the most surprising MRI related thing that I've seen is the kind of vast variability that there is from individual to individual and what differences mean for different people. So the thing that comes to mind as surprising in terms of this science is sometimes we'll have folks come into the lab to participate in a study as part of the control group. So they don't have any particular disorder. We're using them to compare to other people. And we'll find out that there is something very different about their brains. There might be a huge chunk of brain missing, for example. So one of the, we call them incidental findings that, we weren't looking for this particular thing, but sometimes it still comes up, is that there's this part of the brain that connects the two halves. It's called the corpus callosum. And it's part of that white matter on the inside, and it lets your two hemispheres of the brain, the two halves of the brain, talk to each other. And as it turns out, in a certain number of people, this structure just doesn't exist. It's not there. It's called agenesis of the corpus callosum, or dysgenesis when it's kind of partially there. And so this is a surprising thing that comes up in our research, when sometimes we'll have somebody who we don't expect to see any problems with come in and they just have this massive brain difference that they had no idea about. And I find that really shocking and surprising, that you would think that this would have some sort of behavioral consequence, that there would be something visibly different about their behavior because there's this huge brain difference, but that's not always the case. So we talked a little bit about how you can know there's a behavioral difference and you can't find anything in the brain. It looks totally typical, but there's also the opposite. You can have a brain that looks really different from typical brains, but there's no behavioral consequence. And that's a surprising, fun thing to grapple with in research.
That's really fun. One time I was just teaching introductory bio. So like the first class biology students take in college. And we were doing just like a lab test that involved EKGs with your hearts, where you have the little things on you. And this one student's EKG was like flipped backwards. And I was like, that's so weird. And I had read, like while preparing for the course to teach, I didn't know anything about EKGs. I just was like reading the course materials to teach it the next day. And I read that in what's called situs inversus, so where all of your organs are flipped basically on the other side, just some proportion of the population, instead of having your heart here, your heart's here. I was like, I wonder if you have that. I'm not a doctor, but maybe, whatever. And then we just went on. He went to the doctor and he did. He had it. So you never know what you're going to find in science. The weird thing, you never know what what's going to happen that day when you come into the lab. It's a wild ride sometimes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, our next question is from Cassia. This is a cool question. My 6th grade class is attending. We started studying a little bit about neuroscience in regard to mindfulness. Have you done or seen any results of MRI imaging monitoring the effects of deep breathing or any other mindfulness techniques?
Yeah, so this is not necessarily my area of research, but I am familiar with some neuroimaging research that looks at things like mindfulness. And you can find measurable differences in brain activity in response to an activity like mindfulness. It will change over time. Generally, it comes with practice that you can find measurable differences in how the brain works. I can't speak specifically to where and how that happens, because again, functional MRI isn't my main area, and that's also not my area of research, but it's probably also something that's measured a lot with EEG, which is another neuroimaging method that's a lot more focused on brain activity than MRI. It's kind of it's a tool that's much more useful for getting a sense of the time course of brain activity, because that happens on such a small scale. So there are probably EEG studies out there showing what happens in the brain and in brain activity for people who participate in mindfulness.
Awesome, thanks. All right, so we have a bunch of questions all about sleep and how sleep affects the brain. And I do want to say, just last night, we had a session all about sleep. So if you're interested in that, you can go to our YouTube channel and watch a whole hour about it. But really quick, does sleep help clean the brain? What's the difference? Is there anything that sleep helps us with? And what can you tell us about sleep in the brain?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sleep is great. I highly recommend it. So sleep has been shown across a number of different disorders to be important for brain health. And from a psychological perspective as well, getting the right amount of sleep for you is important for supporting healthy brain function, healthy cognitive function. So as you sleep, there's a part of the brain, it's got a really cool name. It's called the glymphatic system. And it is the system that sort of cleans out your brain at night. And so there are studies showing that in various disorders, this system is impacted probably through the way that sleep is impacted in different disorders.
Very cool, thank you. All right, so a bunch of people want to know, like, what got you interested in studying the brain? Like, what was your first realization? You're like, I want to be a brain scientist.
Mm-hmm. I would say, I mean, I had kind of a typical path to it. I was always kind of interested in human behavior. And then I thought that that meant that I would go to medical school and become either a neurologist or a psychiatrist. And then when I got to college, I started doing research. I just sort of stumbled into what was at the time a neurology lab. And that's when I first started looking at these brain MRIs. And like I said, to this day, I'm still fascinated with the mere fact that we can use a giant magnet to take a picture of someone's brain. So I think once I got involved in MRI research, that really sealed the deal for me and helped me come to the conclusion that I would rather go down the research path than go to medical school and to keep looking at these brain images like this.
Very cool. Related to going down the research path, this is from Ms. Lewis's 12th grade neuroscience class again. Do you have to spend a lot of time grant writing or fundraising in your lab?
Yeah, this is a big, important part of scientific research that you can get involved in relatively early on in your training as a scientist. So I have written what are called fellowship grants for PhD students. It's actually, it has been one of my favorite things to do when it comes to writing in science, because you get to take the time to learn a lot about something that might be a little bit newer to you. So things that you haven't already done a bunch of research on. And it's also a little bit more fun to do grant writing, I think, than paper writing, because the results are whatever you imagine them to be, right? You get to say, this is what I think is going to happen. And you don't have this messy, uncooperative data telling you otherwise that you have to sort of grapple with. So yeah, we do a lot of grant writing. If you go down the kind of primary research career path, it is, I think, almost invariably something that you have to do a lot of as a scientist.
Yeah, I like grant writing too. And it's so much better than writing papers.
Yes.
Can't co-sign that opinion strongly enough. All right, we've got a question that I really like from Gage, who's in 4th grade. How does screen time damage the brain, or does it at all? And are there effects of too much screen time on the brain?
Great question. Again, a little bit out of my kind of particular area of expertise, but I can make some conjecture about what might be going on. So I would say it goes back to what I was talking about before about being involved in lots of different types of activities. Whenever you take something to an extreme, something that typically is totally fine, like using a phone, being on a computer, watching movies, all typical things that everybody can and should do in a moderate amount. Whenever you take that to an extreme, it has an impact on your health. So again, speaking more from the psychological perspective, if your screen time is taking away from other important aspects of your life, if it's getting in the way of meeting your responsibilities, those are, getting exercise, having a healthy diet, then yes, it is likely having a kind of negative effect on your brain. And I don't know the specifics of that because I haven't done that study on excessive screen time. But like I said, I can speak to it from a more psychological perspective that if it's interfering with the other aspects of your life that are important to you, probably not great health-wise generally.
Solid advice. This would be a quick question from Emery in 5th grade in Lake Stevens, Washington. Do you ever get grossed out when you look at brains?
I think it helps that the MRI images are black and white, because I think that sort of removes a gross aspect of it, that you're not really thinking about blood and guts kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So definitely helpful that they're gray blobs. I have done, as part of outreach, some sheep brain dissections, and I think I am surprised by how I'm not as grossed out by that as I might guess. I think it's just really cool that we're able to look at this organ that is the seat of everything that we do and everything that we understand. And I think that's sort of, that's mostly what I end up thinking about, as opposed to the fact that this came from inside something.
Yeah, cool. We have a fun question. So if you stop challenging yourself in your life, if you just kind of like go along with the flow, don't read, don't learn new things, will your brain ever smooth out?
That is a fun question. And I would say probably not. It's those folds that we're talking about. This is called, so we had a little bit of nomenclature already. There's that gray matter, the gray matter folds. It's the outside of it is called the cortex. Cortical folding is called gyrification. And your gyrification is probably not going away in response to behavioral changes in your life. So even if you just started going with the flow and didn't do anything new, your brain is not going to suddenly become totally smooth like you might see in like a mouse, for example. That being said, there are changes that can happen in your brain that are not necessarily measurable with the tools that we have. So maybe MRI isn't the best tool to measure the changes you have in response to a particular less healthy lifestyle. But just because we can't measure it with a tool like MRI doesn't mean that it's not having an impact.
Cool, thank you. The next question is from Jensert. How does brain activity differ when you're dreaming versus when you're awake? And what conclusions can be drawn from the differences?
That is such a cool question that I will say I do not have a specific answer to. So I haven't participated as a researcher in any studies using fMRI and kind of sleeping people versus awake people. So I don't have enough background information to answer that question, but dreaming and sleep are very cool things that we do that I will be looking more into now.
Cool. Well, you can check out that session from last night. We talk about dreaming. We talk about the brain waves in different parts of sleep. I will say that session was geared toward adults, but I don't believe I cursed even once during it. So we should be okay. You should be able to watch it, but it might be a little, I might use more big words than I normally do for this series. We've got a couple questions from Roland Roth's class about your lifestyle. Do you have a pet? Do you live near your family? Like, what is being a scientist like? Like, where do you live and where did you grow up and all that?
I like it. It's an easy question.
Yeah.
So I sadly do not currently have a pet. I would love to have a dog, but my apartment doesn't allow them. So I am sort of stuck right now. I live in San Diego, California, and I'm originally from Los Angeles, which is not too far away.
Not
It's
far at all. That's great.
a couple hours driving. Yeah. And my folks still live there, so I get to go up and see them all the time. I moved to San Diego for grad school, so I came here to get my first master's degree, and I stuck around since then for the rest of my graduate education. And I love it here. I will try my best never to leave California.
Yeah. San Diego is about as beautiful as it gets. I have a lot of family in LA and San Diego, and man, it's currently like pouring rain, like thunder lightning outside right here. And I envy
yeah, no, so we're having our early autumn heat wave currently, which is a thing that happens every year now.
Yep. Yes, just stay safe from the fires and you'll be good in California. What is your favorite part of your job? This is from Max.
Awesome question. It's so hard to pick one because, like I said, I get to do so many different cool things. But if I had to sort of pick one from across the many different jobs that I have as a scientist, it's interacting with people. So I love interacting with other scientists and learning from them and talking about cool new science that we can do. I love talking to the participants in our studies and getting their perspectives and learning from them as well. I love talking to patients and their families and figuring out ways that we can help them. And I love talking to people like you and answering your questions and hearing all of your really important and cool insights.
Awesome. Good answer. We've got a question from Nina. What is the reason our brain may not produce enough serotonin like you'd hope that it would?
This is a great question for as someone who's training to be a psychologist, I think we want to develop a better understanding of why some people don't have the optimal amount of serotonin or other neurotransmitters like dopamine that are involved in sort of the regulation of our mood. So I think there's probably a lot of research out there about differences between people who might have something like depression where you see an impact on serotonin, but we don't currently have a hard and fast kind of 100% answer to what is leading to that. And so that's an active area of research that will probably be ongoing for a while.
Long time. Yeah, that's going to be a complex one for sure. Warehouse School wants to know, could you talk a little bit about neuroplasticity and what it is and what it all means for our 3rd to 5th graders?
Can do. So neuroplasticity is this idea that the brain is capable of more change than we had initially realized. So I think earlier on in neuroscientific research, there was this idea that you have this certain number of neurons, you have a period of brain development, and things are then set in stone and don't change after that. And I think what we've realized through a few more decades of this type of research is that the brain is more plastic or more malleable than we realize. So if somebody has a neurodevelopmental disorder, or if they have some sort of acquired brain disorder or brain injury, there are still changes that can occur after that to support better brain function. So brains are capable of wiring in different ways from people to people to overcome problems that come from a variety of different places. So that's sort of what the main idea of neuroplasticity is, that your brain is really amazing and its ability to overcome different types of problems that it might encounter.
Awesome. Thank God for neuroplasticity for sure. Jen's class wants to know, how will having a full 3D picture of all the neurons and parts of the brain benefit your research and the approach you take when using MRI? I almost said mRNA. I've said mRNA so many times this year. MRIs and other techniques.
That would be, I mean, even from just a perspective of being able to look at that would be really cool. But we're talking about like billions of data points, so much information from one single person. So even though that might be a cool development and progress, that if we could use an MRI scanner to get down to that resolution, because right now we're at this resolution of like 1 millimeter cubes. And within one of those 1 millimeter cubes, there are a lot of neurons.
Sure.
So if we were able to measure the individual neurons, we could potentially get a better sense of what's going on structurally or even functionally. But it would also come with this added task of like, whoa, you have way more information now suddenly, and how do you even go about analyzing something like that? So the pros and cons of advancements in the tools that we use. There are some types of neuroimaging that currently go on that can get down to that resolution. So if somebody's having brain surgery, for example, for some other reason, not having to do with research, you can often use a type of EEG, basically called ECOG, where you can do recordings within the brain on smaller groups of neurons. That's not a type of MRI, but you can get to that resolution, but you're not going to be looking at the whole brain anymore. You're going to be looking at a very specific region of the brain.
Very cool. All right, so we always ask everybody the same 2 questions at the end of each session. So here they are. The first question is, you have everyone's attention, this is in this hypothetical situation, in the whole world. You can tell them one thing about your area of expertise. What is it?
Oh, wow. One thing about my area of expertise. This is a tough question. I would say I would take that opportunity to actually talk more about my clinical psychology background and take some time to advocate for mental health and mental health resources. I think there is a lot more awareness and understanding of how important it is to take care of yourself, not only from a physical perspective, but also your mental health. And so I would take that opportunity to advocate for people to check in with somebody, some sort of provider about your mental health, and learn more about how to take care of yourself from that perspective.
Great advice. Doing that has helped me in my life for sure. All right. And the next question is, you still have everybody's attention in the world. You can tell them one thing about anything. It can be as big picture, significant, important, or little and small, but you still want to say it. What do you tell everybody?
I'm trying to think. I should have come prepared with a more kind of fun fact. I would tell everybody about my favorite part of the brain, and it is called the insula. It is a part of the brain that houses the primary gustatory cortex. And if you recognize that word, you know that it means that it has to do with taste. So there's this little part of the brain that's kind of nestled really far inside. It's kind of really buried in the folds, kind of between the frontal and temporal lobes. It's called the insula, and it's just super cool. It's involved in so many different types of things, from kind of self-awareness, emotion regulation, and taste is in there somehow. So yeah, I would urge everybody to look into the insula and learn about primary gustatory cortex.
Cool. All right. Sounds good. Well, thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge with us today. This has been really fun and really interesting.
For having me, and thank you for all of the really cool questions.
Yes. Thank you everyone for submitting your questions. Do you have anything else you'd like to share before we wrap up?
I guess if you have more questions and weren't able to get them answered, please feel free to reach out to me on social media. Twitter is probably the easiest place to find me. I always enjoy chatting with people.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you again. And thank you, Kay, for interpreting for us. Everybody at home, you can get it. So we had a lot of questions today and we didn't get to all of them, although I tried my best to get to as many as we could. If you want a session with a neuroscientist in your classroom specifically, you can absolutely do that. You can sign up for a session. I put the link in the chat for that. We are an organization that relies exclusively on donations to exist. We just couldn't exist without them. So if you can support us, even as much as like $5 a month is wildly helpful for us. You can do that at patreon.com/skypeascientist. I put that link in the chat as well. And lastly, we do these sessions once a week. Next week, we'll be talking about geology with a geologist who, in addition to being a geologist, also is a dancer and likes to incorporate that into her life. And so that'll be really fun to talk about next week. That's all I've got. Thank you for coming. Thank you for taking the time with us. This session will be posted on YouTube in a couple hours. See you next week. Bye, everyone.